Hey, so this will be the third video in the Four Noble Truth series. So the third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And there's two different ways to, um, there's two different ways that this truth takes form in someone's experience. The first way is the realization of the complete cessation of suffering. So the essentially the final goal of the complete realization of this noble truth is the cessation of all suffering, which at first is a temporary experience, but when someone becomes fully liberated, it becomes a permanent experience. But the more common expression of this truth is kind of the mundane cessation of suffering, where rather than all suffering ceasing, it's a very specific type of suffering or a very specific source of suffering that is present in your life and then goes away and is no longer present. And and yeah, the that's basically what I'm going to talk about in this video is the mundane version of this, because the absolute cessation of suffering, which you call like the super mundane, is something that you can't really explain, and neither of these are very useful to explain almost, because it really is something that you experience yourself, more so than the other noble truths, because it's like um it's like the cause of suffering is something that you can uh kind of create like a model of it and show it to somebody, but the cessation of suffering is something you actually have to experience yourself, because I can't cause your suffering to cease. Like it's yeah. But but yeah, to the extent that I can explain, I guess the mundane cessation of suffering, where you you notice a very particular loss of suffering, is connected to the previous noble truth of the process where attachment leads to suffering, and it forms a sort of a cycle where you you suffer at one moment and then you form an attachment about that, and then at some point in the future that attachment leads to further suffering. And so in this case, the cessation of suffering, which would occur in that process, would happen at the location of the attachment, where you can't do anything about the past when you had this thing occur and you formed an attachment about it. But in the present, you can find that attachment, and before it leads to further suffering, you can uh, do some type of technique. There's countless techniques for how you would actually accomplish this, but the idea is that you do something to cause that attachment to go away, to kind of unravel itself, to be solved like a puzzle is a useful way to think about it. And once that's happened, you sort of get a glimpse of the cessation of suffering. And from that point on, that attachment will either temporarily or permanently be gone and will no longer lead to your suffering. And, and this sort of opens up a process by which you can continuously do that with more and more attachments, where you little by little work through all the attachments you have and do various techniques to yeah, essentially solve them, to understand them and dismantle them, until it's kind of confusing at this point, because I I don't honestly know what the final progression of that is, but I think of it as you do that process for a while, where you gradually find your attachments and get rid of them, until eventually you kind of catch on and realize that the process is happening of attachments going away and your suffering ceasing is actually a smaller form of the actual cessation of suffering that you're working towards. And it's kind of like by experiencing the mundane cessation of suffering, you gradually get insight into the absolute cessation of suffering, which occurs with like the full enlightenment, or like closer to it at least. and as you start to understand what the real cessation is, you no longer, it's almost as though the attachments that you need to get rid of to have the mundane cessation of suffering no longer matter as much, because you know that the absolute cessation of suffering can occur outside of those attachments. And it's another one of those things where I can't really explain how it's done or what actually happens, but at some point the mundane attachments no longer matter, and the full cessation of suffering occurs, and you move to the you essentially find the complete picture of the third noble truth. And hmm, yeah, that's pretty much it. This actually brings up something that I didn't mention in the first couple of videos, but is a very useful way of describing the Four Noble Truths. But I think this is probably a good time to mention it anyway, because it's very clear why this third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is something that has to be realized, because it's not something that you can't figure it out until you experience it. And for that reason, you say that you have to realize the third noble truth. I want to say, I'm like 50% sure that's the word. I'm referencing something that a monk taught me a while ago. Not me specifically, but a monk in like a Dhamma talk. Um, because yeah, so the third noble truth you have to realize and see for yourself. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering, is, I believe, something you recognize, and you understand that it's there, but you can't really do anything about it, because unlike the cessation of suffering where you strive to experience the cessation, with suffering it's already there and you don't have to try to like achieve it. It just kind of happens anyway, and you just recognize that it happens. Then the second noble truth, of the truth of clinging to suffering, or clinging to whatever it is that leads to suffering, is something that needs to be overcome. And so you overcome it by um, stopping those cycles of suffering and no longer forming the attachments that that are identified by the second noble truth. So is that in summary, you recognize suffering, you overcome attachment, and you realize the cessation of suffering. And then, I don't know if you heard that. Um, then the final noble truth is the path that leads to the end of suffering, and that is something that you cultivate. So having understood that there is an end to suffering, you then cultivate the path that leads to it, and yeah, that will be the next final video of the series. Um, so yeah, quick overview of specifically the third noble truth is the cessation of suffering is something that occurs on an absolute level as well as a mundane, ordinary level, you could say. Where the absolute cessation of suffering is it starts as the temporary experience of like temporary liberation, temporary nirvana, and eventually turns into a permanent experience where you no longer have any suffering. Whereas the third noble truth in the mundane sense is where smaller attachments and particular things that cause you suffering will cease and become the attachments become undone, and you no longer find yourself in the cycle that leads to that suffering. And that's really something that you experience over time through meditation, and you can gradually move from the mundane sense to the absolute sense of the cessation of suffering. And that pretty much sums it up. I'll see you in the next video.